we want to make some comparison between the short-run aggregate supply curve and the Phillips curve. As you've seen now, you might have expected we derived one from the another. We managed to derive the Phillips curve from the short-run aggregate supply curve. So what both tell us, I put both on the screen now so you can see both relationships. So the short-run aggregate supply tells us that output is related to unexpected movement in the price level. So you see that's the actual output level, and that depends on that gap, which is the distance or how different the actual price level P from the expected price level PE. Okay, so when you compare this to what the Phillips curve is telling us, it tells us the unemployment related to unexpected movement in the inflation rate. So we've got this unemployment gap, and this is the inflation rate. So again, just to explain, this is cyclical unemployment, or the deviation from the natural rate of unemployment. And as a reminder, again, the natural rate of unemployment reflect both types of unemployment, fractional unemployment and structural unemployment, and explain what that means. So again, to highlight this, I have been repeating this many times. The natural rate of unemployment does not mean that the unemployment rate equals zero. It equals the sum of fractional unemployment and structural unemployment. So any deviation from that natural rate of unemployment, that means we have also, if the actual rate of unemployment is higher or above the natural rate of unemployment, that means we have cyclical unemployment. So at the natural rate of unemployment, the cyclical unemployment typically is zero. So anyway, so that means also when output gap is zero, actual inflation. So because when output gap is zero, that means this is the actual unemployment will be equal to the natural rate of unemployment. So that means this will equal zero, and which means that in that case, if that is the case, that means the inflation rate equals its expected level, or the expected inflation rate, because this will equal zero. And obviously, there might be some unexpected or unanticipated supply shock that may change the actual inflation rate. But for any given level of this, or if this is zero, if we assume there is no supply shock, and we were at some point where we are, or the economy is functioning at the full employment level, which is Y bar, or at that level of full employment output level, that means the cyclical unemployment equals zero, and that means the unemployment, or the actual unemployment rate, will be equal to the natural rate of unemployment. And in that case, or that point, you will see that actual inflation pi here equals its expected level pi e, or pi to the superscript e. Okay, so this is one thing we learned from this relationship so far. So if we then try to build more on that, so just looking at both curves, we'll see that the Phillips curve provides similar implication to what the aggregate supply curve suggests, and that's why sometimes people call the aggregate supply curve as the Phillips curve, or the other way around. So what are these implications? So basically what we can see from this equation, if you want output, or if you want the actual output level to go beyond the natural rate level, so that means you need to tolerate some unexpected inflation, this sort of a trade-off. So, and we explained that before, if just to remind you, if the actual output level below the natural output level, or the full employment output level, that means we have a recessionary gap. And again, if we explained that again, that means we have the actual prices, or the actual inflation rate is below the expected inflation rate, and that means we have a deflation. Okay, so it should be the other way around. If we have an inflationary gap where the actual unemployment rate will be greater than, so it'd be the other way around, than the full employment output level. So that means we would have an inflationary gap rather than a recessionary gap on the slide, and then that means the actual inflation rate will be higher than the expected inflation rate, and according to this relationship, that means we would have inflation, or that means inflation will rise as a result of that. So this is again some implication, or things that we learn now by comparing between these two or by looking into these two curves more closely. So when output gap or when output level is given, so at any given of the output gap or output level, changes in expected inflation will change actual inflation directly. So if we take this as given or doesn't change, then that means any changes to expected inflation will be translated directly into changes into the inflation rate. So that's what we call the inflation in this case is self-fulfilling, because when people expect inflation, it happened because they expected the expected inflation. Sorry, when they expect when their expectations for inflation it goes up, so that means the actual inflation rate will go up too. Okay, so and as I already said that before, that the Phillips curve that include expectation or expected inflation is known as expectations augmented Phillips curve, and this is one of the very important implications that you can see here now. That means if people expect inflation to rise, that means the actual inflation rate will go up as well. So this is something as well we learn from this comparison between both curves. So if we move from here, then we look more into expectations of inflation, how that shaped our understanding of the original Phillips curve that we saw in 1958 in the original paper by Phillips, and how that has changed so far to include the inclusion of expectations. And then we would ask another question then, so if we already know how that help us to understand the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, it will remain to think about, or what we need to think about is that how people form their expectations. So what changed the people's expectations, or different economic agents or actors, what changed their expectations, and how these expectations are formed, and that's how this is translated to change in Phillips curve, or in the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So I will tweak if you just tweak the inflation rate equation a little bit. So this is what we saw so far. So if we move this expected inflation the other side to the left hand side, then this is the same. This is a Phillips curve. All what this tells us that what we have on the left hand side in this equation here, on this expression, we have unanticipated inflation. So this is the part of inflation that people didn't see coming, or they didn't expect. And this part tells us on the right hand side we have the deviation of the unemployment rate from its natural rate, and obviously we still have our lovely term that represent nu, or the Greek letter nu that represent supply shocks on the right hand side. So how does this change, or how does this how rearranging this equation that way, or this expression that way, would give us some more insights into the Phillips curve. So basically it tells us now, okay, so if we look at the relationship now in its new form now, the way you look at now, after you rearrange this equation, it tells us that, well, it is important to think of or the relationship between inflation rate and the unemployment, or the cyclical unemployment rate. It's actually important, rather than thinking that way, which is the original Phillips curve. It's important to think about the change in inflation rate, or the unanticipated inflation, or the inflation that people did not expect, and then the cyclical unemployment rate. So if we use that, as I said, we would try to see how this will give us more insights into the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, or what was originally proposed by Phillips in his paper 1958. You will see that in 1960, probably, or at that time, why people, why other economists, when they try to replicate Phillips' work in different countries like the US and elsewhere, it seems they thought that the relationship is still inverse relationship, and it looks like a stable and a very straightforward relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. The reason could be because the inflation at that point, inflation rate was low and stable, and that's why expectations regarding inflation that it was almost zero, or meaning that people didn't expect that inflation to rise. So that means if you take that out from here, so that will give you the original Phillips curve, of course, without that supply shock factor, which again, as I said, it just contributed to our understanding of this relationship after 1970s, when we experienced the oil price structure. So what does this suggest? It suggests that if expectations of inflation are very low, nearly zero, so people don't expect, the inflation rate is very stable, it's very low, so they don't expect inflation to increase. So that means that will give us exactly the relationship we've seen or similar to what we've seen in the original relationship, original Phillips curve, where we have a negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So that was in the 1960s. I'm trying to give more insight, or an explanation why that seemed to be some kind of a stable relationship, or some kind of a straightforward trade-off between inflation and unemployment at that point. Maybe because the expectation of inflation was really very low, people didn't expect inflation to increase. But of course, when we saw what happened with supply shocks, that has some implication to the cost of production, and that obviously increased prices. And the stagflation that we've seen in 1970s has changed the way we think about the Phillips curve. So in that sense, then moving to, as I said, moving to 1970s, that sort of stable trade-off between both variables, or the inflation rate and unemployment rate. And just to remind people that what the original relationship, or what the original Phillips curve suggested, is that trade-off. So if you want to reduce unemployment rate, then you have to tolerate some higher level of inflation rates, and the other way around. Okay, so, and that was something that governments could use. But then, given that now we understand that expectations are something that very important determinant of this relationship. So that means if, for example, the government tried to use that, what was known as or understood as a trade-off between both variables, and they tried to, for example, increase government spending or decrease government spending. They took some policy action to achieve the mix between, or the inflation and employment mix that they want. If people form some sort of expectation about that, they will factor this in their expectation, and that is not going to have any changes to inflation. So that basically is not going to do what, or is not going to achieve what the policymaker aimed to achieve, because now we're bringing in expectations into the picture, and that's how. So what can make a change here, what can change that, is the surprises to inflation rate can have real effect on employment and output. But of course, predictable, or things that economic agents can see happening, obviously they expect happening, they obviously adjust, react to these changes. So it wouldn't have real change, or the policy wouldn't then have or achieve its objective. So this is what we've seen in after 1970s. So beginning in 1970s, you see that in the US, the relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate kind of disappeared. So it's kind of this a scatter plot. So you can't really get that sort of nicely inverse relationship as you could see it here. You can see very smooth and nicely, and can very obvious relationship or negative relationship between both variables. Once you move to after 1970s, you see kind of this sort of relationship vanishes. But if you account for expectation or unexpected, or this form of the Phillips curve where you factor in expectation, so that means you might find some similar sort of a negative relationship between. So the difference between this and this one, now you've got expectation into the picture. You also see that the unemployment rate seems not to affect the inflation rate, but rather changes in the inflation, which again is what we discussed earlier, which is this gap between the actual inflation rate and the expectations about the inflation rate. Okay, and that might give you that sort of inverse relationship or nicely downward sloping curve. So now this is very important. So because this is one point I wanted to cover in this section again when we start talking about expectations. One, I wanted to show you how bringing expectations into the picture now help us or give us more insights into the original Phillips curve and how it works. So as you see here, so we started with just moving this or rearranging this equation, and then we'll show that this is the unanticipated inflation. On the other side, this gap between, or the cyclical unemployment, which is the gap between the actual unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment. And then we try to use that to understand why that relationship in 1960s were very clearly an inverse relationship between unemployment rate and inflation rate, and that sort of trade-off was very clear at that point. And then why or what could have happened in 1970s that have changed this to make the situation, or to make the data coming from the US, for example, show that this relationship disappeared, or that negative relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate has disappeared. Then bringing expectations into this picture, as I said, will give you more insights into the relationship. So in 1960s, maybe expectations about inflation rate was very low, nearly zero. So that gave us that sort of straightforward trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation rate, just assuming there will be no supply shocks, or there's no supply shocks. And moving from there, try to understand this with expectation. So it seems that the unemployment rate affect not the inflation rate itself, but rather the change in the inflation rate. And what we're looking at here is the unanticipated changes to the inflation rate, or this deviation from the actual expected the actual inflation rate and the expected inflation rate. And as I said before, what we've seen here, what we've been calling now in this lecture the Phillips curve, it's called expectations augmented Phillips curve. Again, it's just because it takes into consideration expectations about inflation. So what remains here now to cover in this lecture is how people form their expectation and how that affect the relationship, or the Phillips curve, or the relationship between inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So one way to think about this is that people form their expectations of future inflation based on what they have experienced recently about observation, or what they have observed about inflation. So this sort of if you could say expectation forming mechanism, or the way people form their expectation, it's called adaptive expectation. So basically what it means is that people think of to form expectations about inflation rate in time t, they basically look at what happened in time t minus 1. So if we talk about, let's say, monthly data, so if we have expectation this month about inflation should be exactly the same as the observed or the actual inflation rate in the previous month. Okay, so that is the excuse me, that is the main idea here. So adaptive expectations, that means people form their expectations of future inflation based on recently observed inflation. So last year's inflation rate serve as a good, or last time period, or t minus 1, whether you talk about months, quarters, or years. So in that case, so the t minus 1 inflation rate serve as a good predictor of t inflation rate. So or you can write it that way. So the expected inflation in time t equal the actual, or the observed inflation in time t minus 1. Okay, so in that case you could write the Phillips curve, which we know here, rather than you just replace the expected inflation rate with the actual inflation rate in the in the last year, and that gives you this pi t minus 1. So basically we just replace this expectation by the observed inflation, or you can look at this as the change in inflation rate, which we actually show here. So this kind of change in inflation rate against the unemployment rate. So if you look at this one, we have the change in inflation because we have pi t minus 1, and that's basically the change on inflation. Or you could excuse me, you could use the first way we explain, or we wrote this expression where we have only inflation in time t on the left hand side and then everything else on the right hand side, which means that this just moves to the right hand side with a positive sign. So that means inflation in time t depends on inflation in time t minus 1, and depends also on the gap between the actual unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment. So now we're moving to what this relationship tells us. So what this adaptive, or based on that adaptive expectation mechanism, or the way people may form their expectation about inflation in time t, what this tell us? It tells us if the actual unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, meaning that we have positive cyclical unemployment, that means the inflation in time t will be less than the inflation in time t minus 1, that means inflation will decrease. If the unemployment rate in time t was less than the natural rate of unemployment, that means we have a kind of an inflationary gap, so that means the actual inflation rate will be higher than the inflation rate in time t minus 1, and that means we have inflation increasing. Okay, if both are the same, so if the actual unemployment rate equal the natural rate of unemployment, okay, that means the actual inflation rate will equal the inflation rate in time t minus 1, meaning that inflation will not change and that's why this natural rate of unemployment, called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU for short. So that is because of this relationship when you look at this. So if we are at the full employment output level, that means we basically cyclical unemployment equals 0. That means the actual unemployment rate will equal the natural rate of unemployment rate, and in that case the inflation in time t will equal the inflation rate in time t minus 1. So that means inflation will not change when we are at the natural rate of unemployment rate. Okay, so so this is again just one way to form expectations. As I said, adaptive expectation, which is basically saying that people expect inflation in time t will be equal to the observed or the actual inflation rate in time t minus 1. So also it tells us that the inflation rate has some inertia, meaning that in the absence of supply shocks, so there's no supply shocks here, or cyclical unemployment, meaning that again, which if this equals 0, so that means the inflation rate will not change, will be always will continue as long as we don't have supply shocks, as long as we don't have cyclical unemployment. So that means basically the inflation rate will not change, will be stable at its current rate. So it's not going to change. Okay, so past inflation change or influences expectations of current inflation, which of course it affects wages and prices that people set. But if we have zero cyclical unemployment rate and we have no supply shocks, so that means this is not going to change. So inflation rate is going to be stable, or is not going, will continue to be indefinitely at its current rate. So moving from here, then we could think about what can increase inflation, what can, or how inflation increases or how inflation falls. we have two causes of rising and falling inflation, again, which we can build on our understanding of this relationship. One is cost push inflation, and that I should have added the supply shock term new here. So, but you already know that if we have a supply shock, that basically will, or if we have to be more accurate, if we have an adverse supply shock, that will raise the production cost, and that will induce firms to raise prices and pushing inflation up. So one reason for inflation to go up or to increase is basically cost push inflation, which comes from the supply shock term. So just from here, so this is the supply shock term nu, the Greek letter nu. Again, we use that to represent supply shocks. So if there's an adverse supply shock, so that means cost of production will increase, and that means inflation or prices will increase and inflation will increase. So this is one reason. So cost push inflation. The other one is the demand pull inflation. So according to this, inflation results from demand shocks, basically. So positive shocks, if we have, for whatever reason, aggregate demand curve shift to the right, so that means unemployment rate will fall below its natural rate. So if you assume we moved from a point where, or an initial equilibrium point where we were, or the economy was at the full employment output level, and for whatever reason we saw that there's a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right, or a positive shock to aggregate demand, and we explained different examples before last week about what that means, what a positive shock to aggregate demand mean. But for whatever reason, now we have a positive shock or positive demand shock. So that means unemployment rate will fall below its natural rate, and that pulls the inflation rate up. Why? Because when unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment, so that, again, we explained that mechanism before. We said firms will compete for workers because it's the unemployment rate is very, very low. So that means it's very difficult to find workers, or they want to attract good workers, let's say, or qualified workers, workers with a certain level of skills that they require. So to do that, then they need to offer them higher wages, and if they offer them, because they have to offer them higher wages or increased wages, that means the wages here are, of course, increases. Wages increase the production cost, and that means obviously they have to add this on the prices. Okay, so that means inflation the inflation rate will go up again, and that reason here is because of demand pull inflation. So moving from here, if we want to graph Phillips curve, we said, okay, now taking into consideration whatever mechanism or the expectation formation mechanism which we adopted here, which is the adaptive expectations mechanism. In a few minutes we'll look at other possible mechanisms, but for now we talk about the current inflation, or the expected inflation in time t equal the observed inflation time t minus 1, and that means in the short run policymaker could have this sort of trade-off between inflation and the unemployment rate. But just to highlight here, what we mean by the short run here is the period until people adjust their expectations of inflation, meaning as long as people think that, okay, so expected inflation rate is exactly as the previous t minus 1, or the previous time period expectation, inflation rate. So that means basically it would be stable, but then until there's, let's say, a supply shock or a demand shock that moved inflation or changes the inflation rate. So that means next time period people will change or will adjust their expectation about inflation rate to reflect the new level of the inflation rate. So then what can shift that inflation rate? Obviously, we talk about how people, when they adjust their expectation, this is exactly meaning that the expected inflation rate has changed. So an increase in expected inflation rate will shift the short run Phillips curve upward. So it moves to the right or rightward. So because of now we were at the expected inflation rate 1, and then at a higher expected inflation rate, that means that Phillips, or the short-run Phillips curve, will shift to the right. There are also other reasons, also supply shocks. We talked about supply shocks, or if there's an increase in the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment, again, that will shift the aggregate. Will shift the short-run Phillips curve. So that's basically, so what shifts the Phillips curve? Again, if there's a shift in, if there's a supply shock, if there's a change in expected inflation rate, or if there's a change in the natural rate of unemployment, again, that will shift the short-run Phillips curve as well. So we just from here that if that sort of trade-off applies, so that means we could have what we know as the what we can call the sacrifice ratio, and that means to reduce inflation, policymakers can contract aggregate demand, causing unemployment to rise above the natural rate. So that in that sense, the sacrifice ratio will measure the percentage of a year's GDP that must be forgone to reduce the inflation by 1% point. So usually or empirically estimated at 5%. So as an example here, if you want to reduce inflation from 6% to 2%, so that means you must sacrifice 20% of 1 year's GDP. Which means the GDP loss would be the inflation reduction times the sacrifice ratio, and or you could this loss could be happen over spread over several years. Let's say 5% loss for each of 4 years, and that's basically the cost of slowing down or inflation or disinflation is loss of GDP based on that. So moving from here, I'm just going to conclude with this, as I said before. So one expectations formation mechanism, we talked about adaptive expectation from here, if you remember. So we said people form their expectations of future inflation based on recently observed inflation, but this is not the only way people can form their expectations about the future inflation rate. So there's also another way people can may follow to expect inflation in the future. So as I said, we really talked about adaptive expectations, in which people base their expectation on future inflation based on recently observed inflation. But also there's another mechanism which is called rational expectations, and in that sense, or in that way, people base their expectation on all available information. So that include of course, inflation in T-1, but also include any change in policies or any current policies. So if there's a change in policy that try to achieve something or change inflation, and then that was announced and that or people see that coming, then they will adjust their expectations regarding future inflation rate, taking into consideration what has changed. So as an example, which is I'm going to conclude with this, suppose that the central bank, for example, announced a shift in priorities from maintaining low inflation. So they were focusing on inflation in the past, but now they want to maintain low unemployment, which means obviously they will tolerate some a higher level of inflation rate. And this shift, let's say, will apply from next week. According to adaptive expectation mechanism, then expected inflation will not change because this change in policy did not affect past inflation. So basically, according to the mechanism that we have just discussed about forming expectations regarding future inflation rate, nothing will change because the expected inflation rate in time t equal the actual inflation rate in time t-1. So announcing change in policy today is not going to change the inflation rate in time t-1, and therefore the expected inflation rate in time t is not going to change. However, if the mechanism or if the way people form their own expectations about future inflation is more according to rational expectations, in that case expected inflation rate will increase right away, because again they will factor in all this announcement into their forecast about inflation rate. So according to rational expectation, if there's a change in policy, if there's a change that happened that make people believe that this will affect inflation in the future, obviously they will take into this, they basically factor this into their forecast regarding inflation, future inflation. So, and that's the difference between adaptive and rational expectation.